Just a quick note before we start the show. In an episode of The Front Page published on Thursday, senior Herald writer Simon Wilson said that the Character Coalition believed apartment living should be further out from the central city than Mount Roskill. This was incorrect. The coalition tells us it supports apartment living in the central city and in areas appropriately located in inner city suburbs and near railway stations. Kia ora, I'm Richard Martin, in for Chelsea Daniels, and this is The Front Page, a daily podcast presented by the New Zealand Herald. Over the past decade, New Zealand has seen dozens of community newspapers shut down, newsroom roles cut, and programs taken off the air. A new discussion paper by former NZ Herald editor-in-chief Gavin Ellis warns that these changes are creating news deserts, areas where communities have little to no access to local reporting. The report highlights the far north, Taupō, South Taranaki and Central Hawke's Bay as regions already showing signs of reduced coverage, while parts of Auckland and Wellington are also being affected. The paper argues that without intervention, the impacts will become more visible during upcoming elections, with reduced scrutiny of local government and fewer reliable sources of information for voters. So, how widespread is the problem, and what are the possible solutions? Today, NZ Herald editor-at-large Shayne Currie joins me to discuss what the rise of news deserts could mean for New Zealand. All right, so first off, Shayne, can you explain the concept of a news desert to me?
I can. The news desert was first coined in the US, actually, about 11, 13 years ago. And it's basically an area, it could be a geographic area or an area of population where critical information isn't reaching the people. So it might be what the local council is up to, critical decisions that are being made on behalf of a community that the community is simply not hearing about because there is a lack of a media platform, whether that's a traditional community newspaper or a radio, television network in the case of the States, with the local kind of network system that they have over there. So it's really that inability for a community to discuss information, to know what's going on.
And so do you think New Zealand has these news deserts, or I saw in the report mentions that we might be only ankle deep in the sand?
It's coming. That's Gavin Ellis has completed a very extensive report, and he has looked at geographic regions, and he's pinpointed a couple, in particular the far north areas actually of Wellington and Auckland. And if you recall, just recently Stuff has closed 7 of its community titles in Auckland. I mean, Auckland's a massive city, right? It's really a combination of lots of different cities or small towns, if you like, as a lot of people have said in the past. And so a lot of those areas within Auckland have lost their community paper. Now, there's a big debate as to whether those community papers were serving a purpose, hence why the argument was that they lost a lot of advertising revenue, readership dropped, and Stuff had no choice but to kind of close them.
Yeah, because there's talk of like the zombie or ghost newspapers, and so that might have been sort of what some of those were before they were shut down?
That's right. And look, Gavin Ellis points particularly to Stuff and NZME, which publishes the New Zealand Herald, that they've both closed around 40 titles in recent years. 40 community titles. Now, what's happened is they're big corporates, right? They're always needing to make a profit. They're looking at their cost lines all the time. I've been involved myself around the exec table looking at cost lines. The model that was introduced for a lot of these community papers in order to reduce costs was that they would share some pages of the similar content. Fine in theory, great in theory, and it does work. Where it has an impact, though, is if a story is irrelevant to the community that it's serving. So great if it's, say, puzzles or if you have a general weather map for the areas covered. But if you're then getting into stories which are from completely different regions, then of course the reader's going to say, well, this doesn't impact me at all. And in fact, Rob Drent, who runs the Flagstaff newspaper in Devonport, which is a very successful community newspaper, he actually studied the North Shore Times, the Stuff community paper, for several months and found for a long period there was hardly any local faces in the paper towards the end.
Yeah, so I guess zombie newspaper, it's just hobbling together, so there's no actual original part of it left.
Well, there's a little bit. There's not a lot, though. It's a very small percentage of the overall package. Of course, these community papers also have to rely on a decent share of advertising.
Yeah.
And so the successful ones continue to have a more than 50% ratio of advertisements to editorial content. And so you really do have to make the most of those editorial pages that are left to cover. But yeah, the zombie paper is essentially one where that editorial content is possibly stories from other areas of the region or the country and are not directly relevant to that audience.
So for some of those areas highlighted, the far north, Taupō, South Taranaki, Central Hawke's Bay, those were some of the ones highlighted as being uncovered already. So in those areas where they're looking at potentially becoming a news desert or, only being served by these zombie papers, what are the effects for the general public?
Well, I think just to pick up on a point there, I actually went back and looked at those regions specifically that were named in the report. And in fact, the far north through NZME actually has still the Northland Age, and that's a weekly paid-for newspaper. And in the case of Taupō, it's actually still got a community newspaper that was bought out from NZME by an independent operator. So in those particular areas, there is still a community newspaper or a weekly newspaper serving its purpose. But there's no doubt that there's other parts of the country which are being let down. Now, what that means is that local councils, local politicians, if you take it to the nth degree, can almost get away with anything around the council table because they're not being scrutinised. The community doesn't know necessarily what's going on around the council table. It might be, a decision as simple as local roading or something to do with rates or, the library. These are issues that affect everyday people in these communities and they're not hearing about them. Social media can play a role here, but it's still in terms of councils delivering that information out, but it's still not delivering information that's been scrutinised or mediated by a reporter, by a journalist.
Yeah, it's interesting, like how in 2025, how relevant is a community newspaper like that these days?
Oh, look, there's examples around the country of very successful community newspapers that still operate. I mentioned the Devonport Flagstaff. Rob Drent does an amazing job on the North Shore here in Auckland in terms of delivering a weekly community newspaper. I just looked at some of his latest editions. They're up to 40 pages, chocker full of ads. Now, of course, I don't know what the yields are on those ads, so all of the community editors and executives that I speak to, that they say they're operating at low margins, so that's not, they're not getting rich by any means, but to a T, they all talk about the purpose of the job, serving their communities, being really closely connected to their communities. And so there's still around 70 community newspapers listed on the Community Newspapers Association website that is doing a great job. And so, I wouldn't write them off at all. I think what we've seen in the recent times is the corporates kind of exiting the business of community newspapers, and independent operators who have been there for a long time, they might be taking on more titles, or there might be some new individuals coming in entirely, seeing an opportunity to help their own local communities.
You mentioned local politicians and things, and obviously we've got local elections coming up and then a general election next year. How do you think the effects of all this are going to be felt in those two?
It's a great question. With the local body elections next month, and I've been looking at some of the local community coverage, and they do have extensive coverage, whether that's Q&As with their mayoral candidates or their council, and that's where it's important that audiences and communities hear from these people who expect to be elected to the councils and paid for over the next 3 years. Gavin Ellis in his paper is very clear that he thinks the news deserts will become more plentiful in the next 12 months, and that's a real worry, he says, leading up to the general election where...
Yeah, he said that thinks the term's going to become ubiquitous by general election next year.
That's right, and it is already ubiquitous in other parts of the world. There are examples in Australia, the US especially, and the UK, where there are these big areas that aren't covered by any form of media whatsoever.
There's an interesting statistic about the New York Times has more journalists employed than the entirety of New Zealand. It's about 1,400 in New Zealand, according to a spin-off survey from last year, versus 1,700 employed by the New York Times. It sounds like a pretty stark comparison, but you know, when you look at it, the population of New York is higher than the population of New Zealand. So what is that comparison actually?
Yeah, that is a relevant point. And of course, the New York Times would argue that it's actually an international media company as well. So it's covering the world almost. But nevertheless, I think it does play to a point that one singular media company, the most successful, arguably, newspaper publishing company in the world, has more journalists than an entire country. Now, New Zealand, because of its geographic nature, just our physicality, you know, we are very spread out in terms of our population base. So there are pockets of the country with tiny communities. I've just come back from a road trip of the entire country, and I've gone into brilliant parts of the country. Some places might have 10 permanent residents. Now, of course, they don't necessarily have a local newspaper or a media platform. But in the past, they've probably been served relevant content by nearby towns or cities. Which have these newspapers where they're based.
Yeah, I'd want to ask about the road trip. Is there any, because talking to people on the ground, like how is the general public feeling about this?
Yeah, and I think this again displays the importance of local media in that, and for all media companies, is that I was always told by a former boss of mine, one of my first editors, the two most important roles in any media business is your frontline salesperson in terms of advertising and your frontline reporter. One brings in the money and one brings in the editorial, the stories. And if you can get a business model working hand in hand in that model, then by and large, you've got a very successful business. And of course, that's what the community newspapers have been based on for many years. People who are directly in touch with the people that they're writing about. So everyone's on first term names basis. They know what's going on. The editors themselves are driving the roads that they're writing about every day, you know, and so that's a really critical part of what makes a successful, not just a community newspaper go well, but also any media business, is that the journalists, the editors are out in that community that they're writing about. And so what my own observations from the road trip, having been, 2 weeks on the road, it's not a long time, but in every place I went to, there's so many great stories that, everyone has a story, right? That's, again, another lesson that I was taught as a young reporter. Everyone has a story, and if you just can sit down face to face, you'll get a lot more out of people than maybe a phone call or a Zoom call.
Yeah, look, I probably couldn't have predicted what would have happened if I reflect back on 18 months ago. I knew the challenges ahead for the business, absolutely, but the continued recession and advertising downturn in the market was sort of really pivotal for us having to make some critical choices. So I'm still here, so that's a good sign. And you're right, you've got to take the wins when you can. So it's been an interesting 18 months if I reflect back on sort of where we were 18 months ago. We had to make some really hard decisions last year. The last 12 months really have seen us deliver what has been the worst operating loss that the business has ever experienced.
It's interesting. We've seen a lot of closures across basically every news organisation in New Zealand. NZME, Stuff, Newshub, TVNZ, even RNZ's announcing redundancies. What are the big drivers? Like, is this just a money issue?
A lot of issues. So obviously, for some of the business models, it's the advertising revenue drop that we've seen over the course of, the last decade plus. NZME, of course, has launched subscription service with the New Zealand Herald, the premium service, so building up a new revenue stream in terms of subscriptions, and that's still, still early days. It's only 5 years old, but going extremely well. But it still hasn't matched that traditional print advertising revenue that for so long has sustained and continues to play a critical role for the company. Same with television. For many, many years, television advertising revenue was sky high. Nowadays, TVNZ's revenue, for instance, is in the 200 millions rather than the 300 or 400 millions. And so media companies have obviously had to adapt to to less revenue by cutting costs. We've seen that with everybody. And yes, you're right. We are now seeing it with our public broadcaster RNZ as well, and that the government, different issues slightly, and that it's a reflection of the current economy, is having to cut costs across the public service, and RNZ's impacted by that. But a lot of factors. Obviously, the rise of social media has seen Google and Facebook come in and take away at least 80% of the traditional revenue that media companies have relied upon to fund their newsrooms.
Yeah, and so these cuts, they're being felt globally then, I assume?
They are. I mean, particularly in countries such as New Zealand, the UK, Australia, and the US. And look, all of those countries, media companies are just talking to their governments and bureaucrats about just rearranging settings, if you like, to try and even the playing field up. And we've seen that in New Zealand in the last few years, where the Fair Digital News Bargaining Bill has been a much debated but not yet passed piece of legislation, which would require the social media companies to start contributing to the revenue streams of the media companies. They're relying on the journalism to fund their business to build their business models, and so the media companies have been arguing that social media has a part to play here.
Keeping it global as well, it's interesting just looking at in the last week what's happening in the US. We've seen Donald Trump on Friday floated the idea of pulling the licenses of TV stations that disagree with him or criticize him, and then Jimmy Kimmel being taken off the air as well. So these were political decisions rather than financial. What do you think of New Zealand government's relationship with the media?
Well, I bumped into actually the Media and Communications Minister, Paul Goldsmith, this morning. As far as I'm aware, the executives and the boards have a decent dialogue with the government. I think there's an argument that the government has not, with any sense of urgency, addressed the issues that the media companies have been raising for several years now. And of course, if you remember, Melissa Lee lost her role as the Media and Communications Minister last year because she was seen not to be doing enough. Well, you could argue that Paul Goldsmith has been similarly restrained. Now, what's going on around that coalition table, only they know. But what we do know as a public is that you have New Zealand First, which has been opposed to, for instance, the Sunday advertising ban being lifted for television in the mornings. And so that's played a part in that being stalled. And then when you have ACT, which is opposed to the Fair Digital News Bargaining Bill. So you've kind of herding cats around the cabinet table in terms of all this different possible media legislation. You have the National Party in the middle that's having to appease two different parties. And in the meantime, all of these so-called solutions are not getting passed.
Yeah, well, I remember National were pretty against the potential merger of RNZ and TVNZ as well back a few years ago.
That's right. And of course, Chris Hipkins, shortly before the general election, pulled that as a piece of the Labour Party policy as well. So it was a sort of an Ardern-led piece of legislation. Hipkins put it on the back burner, quashed it, and of course it never went ahead. There is an argument now with RNZ moving into the TVNZ building in the coming 6 months that may see a lot more cooperation and collaboration between the two public broadcasters. It has to happen. And so it's almost a merger by stealth, where you might see some backroom initiatives being shared initially. That might be some administrative, financial kind of areas. But I also see a huge opportunity for the two newsrooms of the public broadcasters to collaborate on some major news investigations or coverage of breaking stories and things like that. And I'm sure the two chief executives, Paul Thompson and Jodie O'Donnell, are no doubt talking about that kind of possibility already.
Do you see any hope in the future of this?
Always an optimist. Yeah, always an optimist. And I do see hope. And whether that's, we've talked today about some of the examples at the grassroots community level. There are some amazing people doing good stuff in our regions and in our communities. I see with the likes of, we just look at the arrangement we're in today. This is the New Zealand Herald broadcasting a daily podcast, which was unheard of even 5 years ago, right? Yeah. As media companies have converged and understood through the use of data, just audience habits and what audiences are interested in. And remember, we have real-time data now. We can We don't need to wait for sales data for a newspaper in a week's time kind of thing. We know instantaneously how audience is enjoying or not, a certain platform. But at the heart of it, I always think people, they have a deep desire to know what's going on around them. And that's where journalism plays a role in terms of making sure that we are, it's almost twee to say it, but that we are holding the powerful to account, and that we are explaining issues to our audiences clearly and concisely, fairly and balanced. And so, always an optimist. There will always be that opportunity. Audiences digitally for the likes of the Herald and Stuff and RNZ and others have never been higher. It's just getting that business model right. And, yes, we still need the advertisers, absolutely, but also finding other revenue streams to ensure that the newsrooms can stay as well-resourced as possible.
All right, well, I think that's a great optimistic note to end on, so we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great. Thank you.
That's it for this episode of The Front Page. You can read more about today's stories and extensive news coverage at nzherald.co.nz. The Front Page is produced by Jane Yee. I'm Richard Martin. Subscribe to The Front Page on iHeartRadio or wherever you get your podcasts, and tune in tomorrow for another look behind the headlines.